Just by way of introduction, Collaborate is a small sort of social consultancy and think tank that works with public services in places up and down the country. And our mission is really to support places to collaborate. And that's a lot about building collaborative relationships between different public services, thinking about building new relationships with communities in places, making them part of the solution, and also thinking about how we might need to redesign public services at the front line as well in order to improve outcomes. And we did this piece of research which led to this report, Building Collaborative Places, which we published earlier on this year, and if you're interested, it's on our website. We did this piece of research because we were increasingly being asked to go and talk to places about how to do this, how to build this sort of collaborative culture and way of working. And we were, as Rick said earlier, seeing lots of ambitious sort of statements being written into place-based strategies, community strategies, that kind of thing, about collaboration. And actually what we found was that collaboration was getting stuck, and we felt that there was some thinking to do about what the sort of hardwiring, the infrastructure for collaboration was, and what was required in order to support new behaviours and new ways of working. And so while relationships for collaboration are absolutely critical, and a huge amount of our work is about people in the room and building those sort of human relationships, and we would never underestimate that importance, we also think that there's some sort of the boring stuff that needs to sit underneath that, really, about how we kind of unpick and rewire the way our organisations actually work. And that's what I'm going to talk to you a bit about today. The comments on the slide there are quotes from some of the interviews that we did for this research. So we based our research in 3 different localities around the country. We interviewed people from across public services, but also from the voluntary sector and from the community and local politicians. And what we kept hearing was this sort of sense that the way that we're currently designing and delivering public services is not working, because it's not actually enabling us to tackle the complex issues that public services are being asked to tackle on a daily basis. And I'm not going to labour this point because I think we've heard absolutely loads about this today, but there does seem to be this general sense that actually this is a time, for various reasons, that we need to rethink the model. And I won't go into that now. And so our conclusion from that work really was that doing a bit less of what we've always done in public services, because we need to cut, we need to make savings across the public services, or doing lots and lots of small-scale innovation is just not enough. We need to take a much more kind of fundamental look at our model of public services across the piece. And so I'm here today not as an expert in policing, but as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about, well, what's the future of local public services more generally? And I think that applies to the police as well as to other public services. So public services need to change. How? We talk about 3 key shifts, and again, I think a lot of this has been kind of covered already in some of the contributions from today, and it's been fascinating listening to places that are actually doing a lot of this as well, not just talking about it. But we talk about recasting public services as part of a broader local system that includes a much wider range of actors who can influence outcomes. And I say that quite deliberately because this isn't just about building collaboration between public service bodies, although we spend a lot of our time doing that. It's also about how we work beyond the public service lens as well. It's about how we work with communities, residents in places. It's about how we work with the voluntary sector and the third sector, and I haven't heard that much about the role of the voluntary sector today. It's also how we work with local businesses and faith organisations and so on. All of these organisations are part of the system that can produce better outcomes in places. And so collaboration and infrastructure for collaboration and relationship building needs to take account of all of those different parts of the system, not just the public service bodies. The second shift is about thinking about how do we kind of deploy that collective resource that we have within these places in a common direction. So how do we get the system mobilised in some common aims about what we're trying to achieve in a place? And how do we understand the different roles that different people and organisations can play? I'm not trying to suggest here that what we're doing is sort of blending everything totally so that you have a completely different, completely integrated system. I think different organisations have different strengths, they have different specialisms, and that's really important to keep hold of. But I also think that we need to be quite mindful about the roles that other organisations beyond public services can play, and also about some of the areas in which we need to slightly step aside from our specialisms and think about the broader role and responsibility that we have to the place and to the people that we're serving. And then finally, we think that we need to use public resource to invest in, build and influence the system. And that's kind of a bit of a sort of esoteric point, perhaps sounds a bit abstract, but what we're really trying to say here is that when we think about the resources, the financial resources available to us in places, it's not just about spending that money on services. It's also about how we are building the capacity of the place, how we're building the capacity of the system, and that includes residents, communities, the third sector, how we're building those relationships, how we're building these new ways of working. And we would argue that collectively it's the responsibility of the system to invest its resource in actually doing that. And again, I think we've heard some really powerful examples of that being done in areas today. So we talk not just about collaborative public services, but about collaborative places more broadly. How do we do it? Like I said at the beginning, what we detect again and again in the places that we're working with and in places that we're talking to is a sort of gap between the rhetoric and the reality. And I know that we've heard from places today who are sort of brokering that gap and breaching that gap very actively. But we see lots and lots of small-scale innovation, lots of ambition around collaboration, and we see lots of places exploring really interesting new principles for public services. So for those of you who were in the earlier session with a couple of people from Greater Manchester, they actually put up a slide which had about 6 or 7 principles that have been agreed across Greater Manchester. And we, as Collaborate, often work with places to think about those principles. We work with strategic partnerships and so on to think about, OK, is there a collective view that we have here, or that we should have here, about what sort of principles are going to guide the way that our public services are operated and designed and so on. We see places trying to do all of that, but we also see that innovation gets stuck at the margins of wider systems, and that the existing organisational infrastructure fractures collaboration. And so I'm sure you've probably all got examples of really, really interesting small-scale innovations within your areas, and I can certainly think of many of those. But what we don't often see, and I think that is starting to change in some of the areas like Greater Manchester where there's devolution, is that translation of that small-scale innovation into real kind of whole-scale systems change. And that's what we're trying to understand how to do in our work. And the infrastructure that I'm going to talk to you about in a moment is what we think is partly what's required in order to translate that ambition into broader systems change. So we think that in order to do that translation, we need to build very deliberately new and enabling infrastructure to support collaboration. And I just want to emphasise again that that is not to sort of underplay the importance of the relationship building. But relationships aren't everything. If your new approach to public services relies on a few key individuals who kind of get it and have agreed a way forward, then it's inherently vulnerable. And actually, again, it's just not enough to kind of overcome the ways in which the way that we structure and run our organisations kind of fractures collaboration. So we, through our research, identified what we call 9 building blocks of system infrastructure. And this is where it sort of sounds a bit boring, because having made a big play that this is all about the future of public services, this is all going to sound really familiar to some extent. These 9 building blocks are all things that already exist in your organisations. They exist in all local public services. And that's sort of the point, because actually what we're saying here is that we kind of need to unpick some of that organisational infrastructure, and we need to rewire it to support whole system collaboration. And again, I think we have heard some examples of places doing that today. So I'm just going to run through the 9 really briefly, and I'm sorry if that's slightly tedious, but I'll try and do it quite fast. Place-based strategies and plans. Again, we've heard a lot today, I think, about the importance of a vision which acts as a sort of a foundation for collaboration, something that everyone can get behind, and it's really important that that is co-produced. I think that can be something like a place-based strategy, an old community strategy. But I think it's really important that it's not just about the change that we're trying to see in a place, but it's also about the ways that we're going to work together to achieve it. And that's where those kind of core operating principles that I think are really, really important. Secondly, governance. Again, we work with a lot of places that are now reconvening what would have been called a local strategic partnership some time ago. And it's really interesting because they have a sense that, public services are confronting some pretty big challenges. We need to work together to kind of work our way through this, but we're not quite sure what the role of this group of people should be. And I think we're still sort of working that out alongside some of our partners as well. But it's certainly about system leadership. It's about people thinking about the place, not just about their own individual organisations. It's about really developing deep collaboration and strong relationships. And I think it's really about the stewardship, the building of that place-based system and the collaborative infrastructure. So actually, I think this is about system leaders understanding some of this infrastructure that I'm talking about now, and understanding how they can unpick the organisational infrastructure that they're sort of traditionally responsible for and rewire that in order to support the collaboration that's going on in that room during the meeting. Outcomes and accountability. It's really difficult to create shared outcomes frameworks, and I know that that's always quite a big barrier. I think at a sort of high level, at a strategic level, it's really important that partners in a place have signed up to a core set of key outcomes that everyone's behind. And again, we've heard examples of Greater Manchester doing that today. This is also about feeling a mutual sense of accountability for those outcomes. And I know that there are things that are outside the local infrastructure that kind of fracture that in terms of the way that inspection regimes and that sort of thing work, and I know that that's really challenging. But as much as possible, this is about a set of organisations signing up collectively up to a core set of outcomes and saying, we collectively take responsibility for these outcomes, and it's not that the police are responsible for those community safety ones and the NHS are responsible for these health ones. Actually, this is about all of us understanding how we contribute to those outcomes. Funding and commissioning. Funding in silos really fractures collaboration, and I'm sure that's not a surprise to you. It can also be incredibly powerful when it's rewired in order to support collaboration. Commissioning also, and this is not even just about how we fund the sort of public service institutions, it's also about how we fund bits of the third sector and the community as well to become part of that system. Often, and this was really highlighted in the research that we did, the way that we commission very narrowly and in very quite restrictive ways really constrains the ability of organisations to innovate and act in new ways. And so we really need to think about how we commission differently, and Collaborate's doing some work on that now. Culture change and people development. So this is where some of the relational stuff comes in, which is absolutely critical. This is about building capacity to create leaders, organisations, a workforce, and also communities that can work collaboratively. We've started to see some really interesting examples of cross-sector approaches to workforce development, particularly in areas like Greater Manchester again, where at the front line we're starting to see integrated teams working at a locality level. And it's really interesting seeing how, I was talking to somebody from Oldham about this, there was no offer on the market for cross-sector training for that public sector workforce in that place. And they had to work with a provider to design a completely different approach for their cross-sector workforce to support them to be able to work in these new ways. Delivery. So, like I said, collaborative, often integrated service delivery that puts into practice those principles, which I think do need to be articulated at a strategic level, and that's part of how you start to elevate this into a new way of working across the system and not just a different form of delivery in a small-scale kind of innovation pilot or prototype. Data, evidence and evaluation. You always hear, and I've heard today, that data sharing is a hindrance to collaboration, and absolutely it is. It's also, though, really interesting in some of the places we work how little data sharing does actually take place. And that's not just at the front line, it's at a very strategic level. The places that we're often working with do not have a collective sense among the system leaders, the senior leaders of public institutions in a place, really what's actually happening in that area and how that's changing over time. And a lot of that data is publicly available, but what we don't do is corral it and kind of consider it across a place and as a set of place leaders. So I think there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done to rethink the way that we do share data and understand data and use data to think about how we make investments collectively, where we want to actually put our money. Collaborative platforms, so I'm sorry if that's a bit of a kind of annoying word, but really what we're talking about here is places, both physical and digital places and spaces where people can come together. So again, this is about supporting that relationship building. It's about enabling people to connect, develop their networks and share information. And increasingly, I think it's connected to the drivers of improvement in complex systems. So Collaborate's been doing some work, as I said, about commissioning And the more that we understand how you operate in complex systems, which I think is what this is all about, the more we understand that spaces in which people can come together who are operating in those systems to reflect and learn together are critical kind of enablers of improvement. And so as we move past sort of new public management and a kind of command and control approach, I think we understand increasingly that giving people the time and space to reflect and learn together on what's worked, which is, again, what we've heard really great examples of, people doing that in places like Greater Manchester today. That's really, really critical. And then finally, I think I'm at the end, yes, finally, communications and engagement. And really this is, again, just about a collective approach to communicating what it is that we're trying to do in a place. And there are some really interesting examples of places that have got some very simple and appealing, in some respects, language about that. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Wigan Deal, but that would be a good example of a sort of a social contract, really, on a page that is about what the council and public services will do and what residents' responsibility are in a place. And that very simple kind of contract has been used to as the sort of front-facing communications piece for an enormously profound and deep-rooted public service reform agenda, actually, that sits behind it. It's also, again, about enabling people to share insight and information and allow that real-time adaptive delivery. So I'm going to stop there. My final kind of claim, I suppose, is that I think that building this system infrastructure across organisations and across places is the work of today's public servants, be it in the police, local government, the NHS, and so on. And if we fail to kind of understand the importance of some of this sort of hard wiring, then I don't think we will get the kind of whole-scale, deep-rooted change that many of us are seeking.